Hey everybody, my name is Sam Polk, and I'm going to tell you about two organizations that I run that basically work in the area of food justice. But before I do, I'll tell you a little bit about my own story, just so you know who's talking to you. And hopefully my slides will come up any second. So I grew up in Los Angeles, and basically from a very early age was really ambitious. And so after college, went to a place that a lot of young men and women go to who are very ambitious, which is Wall Street, and spent basically 8 years climbing the corporate ladder there until by the time I was 30, I was a senior trader at one of the largest hedge funds in the world. And then the crash hit, and it was actually not a bad time for us. I was at one of those terrible funds that was short the market, so we were making plenty of money during that. And now that everybody in the room dislikes me, you know. but basically we were, but it was definitely destabilizing. And you know, around that time, I remember I started reading a lot of stuff on the civil rights movement. I started reading Taylor Branch's 3-part series on Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. And I was particularly taken by the story of the Freedom Riders and this idea of you know, folks basically walking out of a bus into a mob for what they believed in. And I was both moved by that and also thought a lot about how during that time there was a lot of bond traders on Wall Street sort of actively trading their bonds at that time, which is basically what I was doing. And so after a few years of sort of wrestling with the decision, or a few months, I ended up leaving Wall Street and moving back to Los Angeles, where I grew up. And I spent the next few years working on a book and doing a lot of volunteer work. And then one day, basically my wife and I sat down and had a weekend of binge watching of Netflix food documentaries. So we watched Forks Over Knives and Food Inc. And there was one that was called A Place at the Table, and it was about hunger in America, and people have talked about this so far, about how in the wealthiest country in the world, millions of people, and especially millions of children, don't know where their next meal is coming from. And while that broke my heart, what really blew my mind was the argument the film made about the intersection between poverty and food, and basically described these communities that they called food deserts, where there's very little fresh food for sale and tons of fast food. And partially as a consequence of that, in these neighborhoods, there is incredible rates of obesity and diabetes and childhood obesity and heart disease. So much so, and this is partially due to food, but largely and potentially the life expectancy of a kid born in South LA, which is a neighborhood where we work, that has $13,000 a year per capita income, is 10 years lower than Pacific Palisades, for example. What we did, the first thing we did is I founded a nonprofit called Grocery Ships. And Grocery Ships is a program that helps parents living in food deserts get themselves and their families healthy. And we designed this program, food, for anybody who sort of knows food issues, is this incredibly complex situation where it definitely involves access and affordability and education. And it also involves things like stress and depression and childhood trauma and addiction and emotional eating. And so we basically designed these groups to sort of marry those two sort of ideas. So each group, basically it would be moms mostly, would join a group. So it would be 10 moms at a time that would meet once a week for 2 hours. And in those meetings, which were led by members of the community, there would be nutrition education and healthy cooking skills and $30 to $40 worth of fresh produce brought in each week. But the groups would be structured not as a didactic lecture, but as a support group. And so everyone would sit in a circle, and a ton of time would be devoted for each person sharing about all those other sort of more holistic issues around food. And I'll just show you a little bit about what it looks like. This was the first Grocery Ships group in a church bungalow at the edge of a church parking lot in South LA. This was a woman who was in that group, Helen Langley, who had this really intense story. She was a retired school teacher who lived in basically a house with 5 kids, none of whom were hers. They were all the children of her brothers and sisters and friends who were homeless or on drugs or incarcerated, and she had taken these kids into her house, and she told me that for the kids who had homeless parents, they would get to see their parents twice a year on Thanksgiving and Christmas. Those were the days the parents were allowed to come over. They would take a shower, then have dinner with their kids, and then they had to go. And she would say that every time that happened, these kids would come to her and say, Helen, am I going to end up like my mom? And she would say, no, you're going to end up like me. And their health was so important to her, and so was hers, but she was getting sick and those kids were getting sick. And so that's why she joined this program. And I remember when we first started the program, this was what it looked like inside. And the folks inside were, they were excited about the nutrition education and the healthy cooking skills and definitely the fresh produce, and a little bit less excited about the sort of emotional safe space, that we were creating. And, each group starts with a check-in where the question is, how are you feeling? And that first group, basically we got one-word answers or pass, and we actually had to end that group early because there was so little participation. And the same thing happened in the second group, and I was getting worried, and the same thing happened basically in the third group until we got halfway around the circle, and it got to Helen, and she was quiet for a second, and then she looked up and she said, it's been 20 years since anyone asked how I was feeling. And I always remember that, and I think that's true more often than we'd like to admit, I guess. So basically, that was the moment that a collection of strangers became a group, and after 6 months, we had all these awesome sort of nonprofit metrics of increase in fruit and vegetable consumption and decrease in BMI, and more importantly, at least from my perspective, huge gains in things like self-esteem and sense of connection and support. And so by the end of that 6 months, we had these incredible statements. Helen would say, y'all are my family. She would say that when she would come into that group, she would unzip herself, and then 2 hours later zip herself back up again to go out and face her life again. And then Juana, who was this young mom, said, I love this group because it reminds me that I exist, which I thought was really powerful. So that was 2013. We started one group. The next year we did 2 groups. The next year we did 10 groups. Last year we did 20 groups. And Grocery Ships is awesome, and I think it's incredibly powerful. And I started facing the reality of nonprofit fundraising, which, as a lot of people in here have talked about, is brutal and non-scalable. And you see in the for-profit world, these companies like Uber, not to use a bad example, but who 6 years ago was non-existent and then is worth $70 billion. And it's not just about the money; it's about the impact, like really impacting people's lives. And in the social sector, you don't see that. There's basically a graveyard between the thousands of people that start a nonprofit and those that actually do build sustainable organizations. And even when you see sort of grown-up sustainable organizations, it's more like a sick kid became a sick adult, and they're still chronically underfunded and stressed and harried. And on top of that, we kept hearing, from these moms things like, hey, I'm a single mom with 4 kids and 2 jobs. I take the bus to work. I don't have all this time to cook, even though I appreciate the produce in these cooking classes. And so we knew that we had to, provide, an option for them, but we also wanted to try to do it in an economically powerful way. And we came up with a separate company called Everytable, and it's a pretty simple concept. We start with, some incredible chefs, working at a central shared kitchen. And these chefs are creating some of the most incredible, amazing, delicious meals that include salads and grain bowls, but also these hot plates. And these dishes are incredibly healthy, and we're also co-created with a lot of these, folks that we're working with. So we have like a Jamaican jerk chicken with coconut beans and rice and plantains. It's an incredible seller. Cajun blackened fish with sweet potato puree and collard greens. And then down in the front is a Puebla chicken tinga, a traditional Mexican dish that is like incredibly healthy and incredibly delicious. And these are made fresh every single morning and then packaged at the commissary kitchen. And that's the key economic insight, even though it sounds simple, which is that if you think about the standard restaurant model, that's a Chipotle. It's 2,500 square feet of space, 10 to 15 employees, fully built out kitchen. which makes it very expensive to start and a very high cost structure. But for us, because we have a single kitchen that all our locations in LA can use, we can open stores like this is our first store. This is at Hoover and 23rd, a location where per capita income is $13,000 a year. This location is 700 square feet, has refrigerated display cases instead of a commercial kitchen, and only 2 employees working at any given time. And that lowers our cost structure so much that we can basically create meals for so much lower than a standard restaurant. And I'll show you what I mean. This would be a better slide if there was animations, but at the central production hub is where we're creating all these meals. And then we open up stores across LA, some in underserved food deserts, some in more affluent areas. Each store is designed to be profitable, but just differently profitable. So the stores in the food deserts sell food between $4 and $5, which is incredibly attractive versus standard fast casual versus standard fast food, and we can make money on it. And then in more affluent areas, we're able to offer these same meals for $7. And if you think about, I think the sort of beauty of this model is that we started by trying to serve this problem in the underserved areas. And that created, I think, a solution for the entire system where, in more affluent areas, fast casual, the average price point is $13. And the number one thing people blow their budgets on is food, because people eat out over 50% of the time, but they can't really afford $13 a meal, especially for healthy food. So now we've got an option where in more affluent areas, you can either go to Sweet Green for $13 or you can go to us for $7. The food is incredible, as good. You can get in and out a lot faster. You can buy 5 at a time if you don't want to cook at home. And you just save an incredible amount of money. So this is what our first store, that Everytable store opened last July. So that's going to be a year during which that's what it looks like basically during lunch. And that will have served 150,000 meals in July. This is our store in the Crenshaw Mall in Baldwin Hills, also selling meals between $4 and $5. This is our store in downtown LA, selling meals $7, $8. And this is our brand new store in Santa Monica, and that picture makes it look empty, but it's actually, at least yesterday, our best-selling store, selling meals at $7. So we're opening in Century City next, and then Watts after that, Compton after that, and we'll see where we go. I want to talk a little bit about hiring. That's a guy named Ricky Porter who came to us through the Right Way Foundation. He's a former foster kid that just aged out of the system, had been through 20 different homes growing up. That is not an uncommon experience in South LA. That's his daughter, Everly. I have a daughter about the same age. Her name's Eveline. I can't help but think about the two of them together and, the differences in life expectancy and earnings capacity and all these things, and Ricky and I, and what inheritors we are of systems and privilege, some of us, and and the thing that I've been struggling with these days actually is that this slide is great, and we hire former foster kids and formerly incarcerated people from grocery ships. And we pay them well, $13, $15 an hour. And you know what? That's not enough. That is not a solution for somebody like Ricky to get, and his kid to get on the same path as my kid. And so, one of the things that we're working on now, and I say this for some of the folks who are in the foundation world, because I think there is such an enormous opportunity for this intersection between public and private capital. So we have basically partnered with a local civil rights organization called the Brotherhood Crusade in Watts. And we've got a local foundation who's putting up the $200,000 to build out the Watts location. That location then, the profits of that will pay back that foundation, after which basically an entrepreneur from the Brotherhood Crusade will be the franchisee of that location. And that's potential for 6-figure income and more, and owned by the community, and massive equity potential as well, both for our company, which is great, and for these communities that we're trying to serve. So thanks a lot for your help. Appreciate it.